Millionaire's secret test for his sons on a blind date went horribly wrong. Edward Kingsley sat alone in his vast mansion, the ticking of the antique clock the only sound in a house once filled with laughter. A reclusive millionaire widower, Edward had built an empire from nothing, yet in the quiet of his twilight years, he worried deeply, not about money, but about his two sons. Zach, the older, was charming, confident, and effortlessly social, but also arrogant, shallow, and obsessed with status. Noah, the younger, was kind-hearted and sensitive, but often hesitant, withdrawn, and unsure of his place in the world. Both were nearing 30, yet neither had experienced love that was real, honest, or grounded. Edward feared they would mistake luxury for loyalty, attraction for affection. So he devised a test, one that would strip away their privilege and force them to meet love face to face, without masks. His plan was bold. The three of them would travel to a remote countryside village under false identities, disguised as poor travelers. There, they would stay in a humble inn and meet two local women under the pretense of filming a small-town documentary. The women would know nothing of their true identity or wealth. Edward wasn't interested in matchmaking. He wanted to see if his sons could be seen and loved for who they truly were. When he shared the plan over breakfast, Zach laughed mockingly, calling it a twisted reality show. Noah, though skeptical, listened quietly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Edward remained firm. "This isn't a game," he told them. "It's a window into what matters." Days later, they packed simple clothes, left their phones and luxuries behind, and drove toward Willowbrook in an old van borrowed from a friend. Gone were the chauffeurs, the penthouses, and the attention. The drive was long, through winding hills and sleepy towns. When they finally arrived, the village felt like another world. Quiet streets, flower-draped fences, wooden cottages, and warm smiles from strangers. Their innkeeper, an elderly woman with silver hair and soft eyes, welcomed them with freshly baked bread and a key to a small room with creaky floors and a shared bathroom. Zach groaned at the lack of amenities, while Noah stared out the window, drawn to the simplicity. Edward, dressed in faded jeans and a flannel shirt, looked nothing like the man in Forbes magazine, and for the first time in years, he felt human. As night fell over Willowbrook, the air carried a stillness unfamiliar to them. Tomorrow, they would meet the girls, but tonight, they were just three men in a quiet village, searching for something money could never buy. The morning sun stretched softly across the rooftops of Willowbrook, casting golden rays over the misty fields as the village slowly came to life. Birds chirped from the trees, and the faint clatter of dishes echoed from the small bakery down the lane. Edward, Zach, and Noah stepped out of the inn in their worn jackets, blending seamlessly with the quiet rhythm of the town. They had been told to meet at the community center by noon, where the documentary shoot would begin. What they didn't know was that two young women were already there, sipping tea and glancing curiously at the listless production team preparing microphones and chairs. Ava was the first to speak, her voice bright, laced with mischief. She was petite, but carried herself with fierce energy, her hair tied back in a messy bun, apron still slightly flour-dusted. She had just finished her morning shift at the cafe and insisted on coming as she was, refusing to dress up for strangers. She had dreams, bold, wild ones, of owning a bakery where every pastry had a story and every customer left with more than just a sugar rush. She believed in sweat, in stories, in people who showed up with empty hands but full hearts. Lily, beside her, was quieter, but no less powerful. She wore a navy cardigan over a floral dress, and her eyes were soft with something deeper than sadness, an empathy shaped by years of teaching children no one else paid attention to. Every Saturday she volunteered at the nearby orphanage, reading books to little ones and braiding the hair of girls who called her Miss Lily like she was family. Unlike Ava, she had dressed with care today, not to impress, but because respect was a habit to her, not a performance. When the boys finally arrived, it was Ava who smirked first, elbowing Lily as Zach swaggered through the door, clearly amused by the rustic setup. Noah, in contrast, offered a small nod and a sincere smile, tucking his hands nervously into his coat pockets. The introductions were casual, guided by the production assistant. Fake names were exchanged. The boys called themselves Eli and Nathan, while Edward became Mr. Reed, claiming to be their uncle. Ava tilted her head, instantly suspicious of their accents and polished manners, but said nothing. The first group activity was a simple game, truth or dare, with questions pulled from a jar. Ava rolled her eyes, but played along, while Lily offered thoughtful, genuine answers that surprised even Noah. Zach treated it all like entertainment, teasing Ava when she refused to answer a question about past relationships. She fired back with witty sarcasm, but a glint in her eyes suggested she wasn't easily fooled. As the hours passed, walls began to shift. Over shared sandwiches and stories by the fountain, connections began to bloom, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. Noah and Lily talked about books, how stories heal people, how silence isn't always empty. She listened to him like no one else had. Ava challenged Zach on everything: his taste in music, his answer to what makes a good man, even the way he looked at the world. For once, Zach didn't win the conversation. That night, after the shoot wrapped, the four of them lingered in the courtyard under a flickering lamp. Laughter came more easily now, filling the air with something new, something warm. Edward watched from the bench near the inn, arms folded, observing not as a millionaire, but as a father. He noticed how Noah's eyes lit up when Lily spoke, how Zach seemed both frustrated and fascinated by Ava. The boys said goodnight, retreating to their room with tangled thoughts and tired smiles. In the room across the village, Ava sat at her desk, sketching a croissant-shaped logo for her bakery. Lily read the letter from one of her orphan students and looked out the window, wondering why Nathan's smile had stayed in her mind so clearly. None of them knew what tomorrow held, but for the first time in a long time, something real had begun to stir beneath the surface. The second day in Willowbrook began with a quiet kind of anticipation. The morning air carried a light breeze, cool against the skin, and the streets buzzed softly with the hum of local life. At the small village library, Lily had invited Noah to help with a children's reading hour. He hesitated at first, but followed her into the cozy room where mismatched cushions lined the floor and shelves overflowed with gently used books. As Lily read aloud, her voice soft and animated, Noah sat beside her, silently watching the way children leaned in, completely captivated. Afterward, they stayed behind, sorting books into dusty cardboard boxes. Lily shared how she used to hide in libraries as a child, how stories made her feel less alone. Noah opened up too, speaking in quiet fragments about a mother he barely remembered, a childhood of nannies and silence. They didn't look at each other constantly, but when they did, the glances lingered a second longer than necessary. Across the village, Ava dragged Zach to the Saturday market, refusing to let him sit around doing nothing. She gave him a basket and told him to pick vegetables like a grown-up. Zach, used to marble counters and prepared meals, fumbled with tomatoes and complained the whole time. But Ava didn't indulge him. She teased, challenged, and when he made a snide comment about the simplicity of village life, she looked at him dead in the eye and said, "That simplicity keeps people grounded. Try it sometime." The words struck deeper than he let on. Later that afternoon, as they sat by the edge of the lake, Ava took off her shoes and dipped her feet into the water, talking freely about her mother's recipe book and the dream she carried in her chest like fire. Zach watched her, trying to understand how someone with so little could be so full. For the first time, he listened without performing, without waiting to speak. Meanwhile, Edward sat quietly near the town's square, sipping weak coffee from a paper cup, observing each interaction like a man studying the past and future at once. He noticed the small things, Noah holding a door for Lily even after she had walked through, Zach handing Ava a towel without being asked. These were not the gestures of wealthy heirs. They were the choices of men trying, maybe for the first time, to be seen for who they were, not what they had. In the evening, the group met again at the inn's garden, lanterns swaying gently above them as they shared a homemade meal from the cafe. Laughter came more easily now, stories flowed more freely. Noah and Lily sat close, but not too close, as if proximity was now a quiet promise. Zach offered to help Ava clear plates, something he'd never done in his life. For Edward, it was everything he had hoped for. But later that night, as the group drifted away and the garden emptied, Zach wandered into the local tavern alone. Perhaps it was the wine, or the ease of forgetting. But somewhere between drinks and bravado, he began to talk. To a curious stranger seated nearby, Zach let a few things slip. Not names, but phrases, hints. "Our father's a big deal," he said, smirking. "Back in the city, we don't exactly live like this." The man laughed, intrigued, and asked more questions. Zach didn't notice the barmaid watching from behind the counter, her eyes narrowing as the puzzle pieces clicked. She had seen Ava earlier that day with him. She had heard the name Kingsley whispered among tourists once. The tone shifted in the room, just slightly. A seed of suspicion had been planted, one that wouldn't take long to grow. Outside, the moon hung low and heavy over Willowbrook, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. Edward sat on the bench near the inn again, unaware of what had been said in the tavern, still smiling faintly at the thought of his sons finally learning what it meant to connect. He didn't yet know that something had been set in motion, a single careless moment that could unravel everything. The sun rose slowly over Willowbrook, but the usual warmth that filled the village air was strangely absent. Clouds drifted in low and pale, as if the sky itself sensed something unsettled. Inside the inn, Edward stirred from a light sleep, unaware that while he rested, the quiet trust he'd seen blooming the day before had begun to wilt. At the cafe, whispers were already circulating like the morning breeze. The bartender from the tavern had mentioned Zach's careless words to his cousin, who mentioned it to the florist, who brought it up while delivering bread to the cafe. By breakfast, the truth had swept through town like wildfire. One of the visiting poor travelers had claimed his father owned half the city. Ava stood behind the counter, refilling the coffee urn, her movements sharp and distant. The words played over in her mind, echoing like betrayal. She didn't need full proof. She had trusted her instincts, and now she felt foolish for ignoring the little things, the posture, The expensive language disguised in casual tones, the way Zach sometimes slipped into entitlement without realizing. When Zach entered the cafe, with a crooked smile and sleepy eyes, the air stiffened. Ava didn't even glance at him. She walked past without a word, letting the silence speak for her. He paused, confused at first, then annoyed, then slowly anxious. At the other end of the village, Lily had just returned from the orphanage when she ran into the baker, who hesitated, then gently asked if she knew who Nathan really was. Lily's heart dropped. She hadn't heard the tavern story directly, but she could feel it in the way people were now looking at her. Curiously, pitifully. When she saw Noah that morning outside the library, she didn't greet him with the usual smile. Her arms were crossed. Her eyes searched his face for confirmation or denial. But before he could say anything, she simply asked, "Was any of this real?" The question hurt more than Noah expected. He tried to explain. They hadn't lied out of cruelty, only to protect the test's purpose. But the words fell flat. He could see the disappointment flicker across her face like the closing of a door. "You could have just been honest," she said, voice calm but wounded. "You didn't need to hide who you are to see who I am." Back at the cafe, Zach followed Ava outside, trying to defend himself, saying it was just a joke, a stupid comment after a drink, nothing more. But Ava wasn't having it. She turned to him, eyes blazing. Not angry, but hurt. "You had a chance to be someone different," she said. "Someone real, and you threw it away for a moment of ego." Zach stood there, silent. For the first time, he didn't have a clever line, just guilt. Edward watched it all unfold. From the corner bench in the garden, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had begun this journey with hope, with the belief that stripping away wealth would uncover something beautiful in his sons. But now he could see the cracks, deep ones, painful ones. He hadn't just designed a test. He had unknowingly manipulated real people into a false setup, hoping to force authenticity. But the cost was too high. He had watched Noah change, open up, find something pure in Lily. And he had seen Zach soften, wrestle with discomfort, begin to let someone like Ava in. And now it was all collapsing. Not because they weren't capable of love, but because trust, once fractured, was almost impossible to repair. That evening, the group was supposed to meet again at the garden, but only Edward showed up. The lanterns swayed gently in the wind above the empty table. The food sat untouched. The laughter that had once echoed there was gone. In its place, only silence remained, a silence heavier than any truth. Edward leaned back in the chair, his heart aching with the weight of consequences. This was never what he intended. He had wanted to teach his sons a lesson. Instead, they had learned the hardest one of all, that love, once lost through dishonesty, doesn't easily return, and that sometimes even the best intentions can leave behind real heartbreak. The next evening arrived with the weight of unfinished conversations and hearts still raw from truth. Edward, after a long day of pacing and soul-searching, sent quiet invitations to the others for one final dinner at the inn's private dining room. The table was set with care, candles lit, fresh bread on the side, a home-cooked meal prepared by the kind old innkeeper who didn't ask questions. Edward sat at the head of the table, wearing the same plain clothes he'd worn all week, but his expression was different now, less guarded, more vulnerable. One by one, they arrived. Noah entered first, his shoulders slouched, eyes tired, carrying silence like a second skin. Zach followed minutes later, noticeably more subdued, hands buried in his coat pockets. Then came Lily, her steps hesitant, face unreadable, followed finally by Ava, who walked in with her arms crossed, gaze cool and direct. The room held its breath as Edward stood. His voice, when it came, was calm but steady, laced with the heaviness of a man finally confronting the truth he'd avoided too long. "I owe all of you the truth," he began, looking not at his sons, but at the women. "My name is Edward Kingsley. I'm not a retired mechanic or a city drifter. I'm a wealthy man, one who has spent too much of his life watching his sons grow up in a world that teaches them money can solve everything." He paused, letting the words settle. "This trip, this experience, the idea was mine. The disguises, the documentary, the blind dates. I orchestrated it all, not to deceive you, but to teach my sons something I feared they were never learning. What it means to be real." Ava's expression didn't change. Lily's eyes shimmered. Edward continued, "You were never supposed to get hurt. That wasn't the plan. But I see now, feelings were involved. Honest ones. And that's what makes this so hard to say." The silence that followed was deep, stretching wide between them. Ava was the first to speak. Her voice was firm, steady, but her hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table. "I don't care that you're rich," she said, eyes fixed on Zach, then Edward. "I care that I believe something that wasn't true. I opened up. I showed parts of myself I don't show anyone. And it turns out, I was talking to characters in a story someone else wrote." She shook her head, pushing back from the table. "It's not about the money. It's about the manipulation." Zach looked down, unable to meet her eyes. For once, the weight of his actions settled fully on his shoulders, and no clever remark came to his defense. Lily stood slowly. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. Her silence was more cutting than any words. "I thought you were quiet because you were kind," she said softly to Noah, "not because you were hiding." Noah tried to speak, but no sound came. His throat tightened with regret. Lily looked at Edward, her gaze full of a pain he hadn't anticipated. "You say you wanted them to learn what's real. But did you ever stop to think that maybe we already were?" Her voice broke slightly. She turned away, her footsteps light but final, as she walked out, tears falling silently down her cheek. The door shut behind her, like a punctuation mark the room wasn't ready for. Ava stood there for a moment longer, her jaw clenched. Then she looked at Zach, one last time. "You almost had a chance to be someone worth knowing," she said. "But even when you had nothing, you still clung to the lie." She left without another word. The door closed again, leaving only the echo of what could have been. Edward sank slowly into his chair. The proud man, the orchestrator of this test, now sat like a father who had lost more than he'd planned. Noah sat across from him, staring at the table, his chest rising and falling with the weight of shame. Zach remained still, his fists clenched under the table, eyes unfocused. And for the first time in years, Edward felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. True remorse. Not for being caught, but for the simple, devastating fact that he had broken something honest, something rare, something that wasn't his to control. The candles flickered, casting long shadows on the wall as three men sat in silence, stripped of disguises, surrounded by truth, and haunted by what their choices had cost them. The days that followed were quiet, heavy with reflection. The three men returned to the city, but the mansion no longer felt like home. Edward rarely left his study, the once proud walls now echoing with the silence of consequences. Noah moved through his routines like a ghost, burdened by thoughts of what he'd lost. Zach retreated into himself, skipping parties and ignoring invitations, unable to escape the image of Ava's final words. Time passed, slowly at first, then faster, as it does when wounds are left unattended. One grey morning, as the city buzzed outside his window, Noah folded a piece of stationery and slipped it into his coat pocket. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He packed light, just a duffel bag, a notebook, and the letter he'd rewritten 3 times. The journey back to Willowbrook felt different this time. There was no disguise, no game, no plan. Just him. Just truth. The van he drove was borrowed, dented, and slow, but it gave him time to think. When he arrived, the village hadn't changed. Children still played in the street. The bakery still smelled of cinnamon and bread, but Noah wasn't sure if he belonged here anymore. He didn't go to the inn. He walked straight to the small school where Lily taught, unsure if she'd even speak to him. Through the classroom window, he saw her reading to a group of children, her voice gentle, her posture relaxed. When the bell rang and the children scattered, he stood by the gate, unsure of what to say. Lily spotted him, paused, then slowly approached. Her expression was cautious, but not cold. Noah held out the letter, creased, heartfelt, trembling slightly in his hands. "I don't have anything to offer but honesty," he said quietly. She took the letter, read it on the bench beneath the old elm tree, and said nothing for a while. The silence between them wasn't painful. It was full, thoughtful. Finally, she looked up. "You could have just started here," she whispered, "but I'm glad you found your way back." Her hand brushed his, and in that moment, there was no need for grand gestures or explanations. Just 2 people, stripped of pretense, beginning again. Across town, Ava arrived early at the bakery she worked in, unlocking the doors to find an envelope tucked into the mail slot. No return address. Inside was a certified check, large enough to buy the bakery space she'd dreamed of for years. There was no note, no name. But she knew. She didn't cry. She didn't rush to call anyone. She simply folded the check, pressed it to her chest, and whispered, "Thank you," to the empty room. In his office overlooking the garden, Edward stood at the window, watching birds gather on the branches outside. He hadn't spoken much since their return. He had let his sons find their own way, knowing that some lessons couldn't be taught, they had to be earned. When Noah called to tell him about Lily, Edward listened silently, then smiled faintly. "Good," he said. "Just be who you are." That night, Edward sat alone at the same bench he had watched from in Willowbrook, now placed in his garden. He thought of the lies, the masks, the mistakes, but also of the courage it took for his sons to face the wreckage and choose something better. He had designed the test to control the outcome, but life had shown him something truer. You don't earn love through strategy or deception. You find it when you're willing to risk everything by being real. As stars bloomed above the mansion, soft and forgiving, Edward closed his eyes and breathed deeply. His plan had failed in every measurable way, and yet somehow it had worked. Because in the end, the greatest lesson wasn't about finding the perfect partner. It was about discovering who you are when there's nothing left to hide.